Welcome everyone to this session. This session is really going to be focused on how the COVID-19 has created multiple challenges, but there's also some solutions for MSLs. And so for this session, I'm going to be joined by Bruno LARVOL, who is the CEO and founder of LARVOL, Vanessa Jacobson, who is the executive director of MSLs at Nectar Therapeutics, and Allison McReynolds, who is the North American Regional Medical Director for Jazz Pharmaceuticals. So Vanessa, Allison, Bruno, thank you very much for joining me here and being a part of this.
Of course, thanks for having us.
And thank you very much, Samuel. And I heard that the number of participants in this meeting are gonna break records today, so it's very exciting.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to start, Bruno, with having LARVOL here. I know you guys do a lot of cool technology that certainly can offer some solutions here. But the record that you alluded to, I think, certainly speaks to a lot of MSLs are challenged with this, and we're looking for solutions. And so really today's session here for everybody listening, this is going to be a little different than the previous format in that we are just going to have an open panel discussion. We've got several things we want to talk about, but certainly we want to encourage all of you listening to put in your questions in the chat box. So I will be monitoring them. We will try to get to as many of those as possible throughout our session. And so I want to start with all of you, and maybe Vanessa, I'm going to start with you just to get us started. And I want to ask this question to all of you. We think about how the COVID-19 has had a dramatic impact and made several changes to the MSL function and how we engage with KOLs, and frankly, cross-functionally as well internally. So I want to start with what has changed over the last several months. Let's call it 8 or 9 months, depending on how you're measuring this, since the beginning of COVID. And especially as it relates to the MSL function. What has changed?
Thanks, Samuel. So in my opinion, I think that there have been considerable changes on the day-to-day operations of being an MSL, but I also think that the fundamental role of the MSL really has remained quite constant. But how we work is really what is quite different than what it was 12 months ago. And really, when I think about this, I think about the different facets to this conversation. And there's a lot of different variables that really impact at a very granular level how each MSL has experienced this change. As an example, different therapeutic areas have been impacted to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the products of in the portfolio that you support. There's also been differences there. Even where you're at geographically, are you in New York or are you in Iowa? That's also changed. And then temporally speaking, I think we were in this crisis mode, this very acute situation that started in March and lasted for several months. And then we transitioned into this maintenance kind of mode, if you will. It's not our new normal, but we're getting used to it, I think, as the days go on. So there's a lot of different things, I think, to keep in perspective when you ask someone this question. But in general, I would say there was a dramatic reduction in the activity in terms of the number of HCP engagements. And obviously the method for those engagements, which pre-COVID were primarily face-to-face, really shifted entirely to virtual. And I think MSLs have always done virtual engagements, phone calls, emails, WebEx meetings, but that made up a much smaller percentage of their business than it does today. And I would say that, when you factor into, the number of engagements, the mechanism for the engagement, the kind of third element is the duration of the engagement. And even though MSLs spend way more time with HCPs than sales representatives, as an example, the length of the engagement has decreased quite dramatically, and based on some of the statistics that I've seen, almost by 50%. So those are some of the big changes from my perspective, and I'll let others on the panel weigh in.
Yeah, excellent. So good place to start. We're going to come back to some things you had mentioned. I think some great observations, Vanessa. Allison, can you address that as well?
Absolutely. So I think, my response to that is really similar to Vanessa's, and that is, in some ways nothing has changed, and in some ways everything has changed. I always think about the role of the MSL is so critical to the business, to ensure that our physicians have the right information to use products confidently and correctly. And that means that, we're educating on the disease state, we're educating on our products, we're identifying the data gaps, we're collecting insights to guide our overall strategies, and we have the utmost credibility and fairness in our approach to the science. And all of that is still critically important. And all of that is still incredibly important both to the business and to the KOLs. When I think about what's changed, there's that shift to a virtual setting, which necessitates in many ways, shorter meetings. What we've seen that's been successful is more agenda-driven reasons to meet. So, historically it's scientific exchange and maintaining that relationship that's a little harder to do when we think about our KOLs as being as Zoom exhausted as we are. They're people too. They've got families and they're doing telehealth and they're on Zoom conferences, and to ask for that time, you have to be pretty focused and clear in what your goal for that meeting is. So, I think it's definitely kind of more agenda-driven, focused meetings, shorter meetings, but it's opened up some great opportunities as well. So I think gives MSLs a chance to maybe network KOLs across regions or territories. I think we can do more project-focused work that might allow for a handful of KOLs across the country to be on a Zoom meeting around a specific project. So I think there are some opportunities that come with this, and my hope is some of those new learnings and some opportunities will fundamentally change the role for the better in the future. So I see some positives here. It's definitely a challenge, and I don't want to understate that, but there are some real opportunities as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well said. I think both of you had talked on a couple of points here that I want to revisit before we move on from this. Allison, you had mentioned what I love and what I picked up there. Maybe we could just dive a little deeper into that. Some things haven't changed. You alluded to that. Could you talk a little more about some of the things that haven't changed, and specifically, because as you may recall and may be aware that we have something like over 1,900 people that have registered for the conference in 63 countries. We have MSLs literally all over the world. One of the challenges that we're thinking about now is how does this impact KPIs and metrics and really expectations? Because one of the things we want to share with during the conference here is I want to tap in, and I know everybody else is sitting there thinking, wow, I get an opportunity to engage and learn from Allison and Vanessa and Bruno. So can you, again, I'm going to go back to Vanessa on this as well, but can you talk a little bit about that? Like, some things that haven't changed, and how does that impact expectations?
Sure. So, I think the fundamentals, like I said, haven't changed that much. And a lot of the activities that we engage in, we've been able to rapidly convert to a virtual setting. I think being that kind of scientific think tank within the company, being a credible resource, we still have to be up to date on the data, and we need to provide great forums for MSLs to keep that scientific sharpness and expertise. I think medical congresses have all gone virtual, but we have to do our best to make sure that our data are front and center and top of mind and seen by those who have interest. We need to be covering those conferences to see what new data are out there that might inform our company activities broadly. But we also have to kind of go with the flow in a lot of ways. So I think in the immediate post-COVID environment, we were just like, all right, we're out of the field now. What's all the admin stuff we can get done before we go back into the field? None of us knowing exactly how long it would be. But watching that, Vanessa spoke to the regional variability. Are your expectations the same for your New York MSL in April as for your, Texas MSL at that time? And probably not. But I think it's more about how creative are you? I think as a management team, there's a big onus on us to give the team the right tools, to give them a reason to engage with their KOLs. I'm trying deliberately not to set some kind of clear metric expectation. It's around what can you do to move the business and to do the right thing. So, one of the things we capture is, we have, our data mentioned by KOL speakers at conferences in a non-company sponsored manner. What does it take to get there? It may be a really quick Zoom call with that KOL and only one. Whereas before it was something where the expectation is that you're meeting them with a certain, frequency or regularity, and really kind of what do we need to do to maintain the business in the best way. I think we're in the throes of a virtual launch right now. The clear end game and the objectives remain the same. How we do it can vary. But we also have to just roll with it. We saw, a complete absence of activity, in that late March, early April timeframe. And then as we moved into the summer months, that started to open up again. But I think we need to be prepared for the fact that we may get shut down again at some point this fall. So I think we really just have to be flexible and objective focused. And, the management team needs to be really effective in getting the right tools in the MSL's hands to work well in this environment.
I love that, by the way, the tip of really it's less about the metrics and more about what's going to move the business and the KOL relationships forward. Vanessa, any thoughts on that in terms of how this challenge has impacted us, and does that necessitate changing our expectations, especially around metrics? And there's a big concern about MSLs. How am I going to be measured if I'm getting less access, that I think you had alluded to?
Yeah, so I want to make a remark specific to metrics, but I really want to take it back to kind of a broader perspective. So in general, I would say that, metrics are often needed to support staffing models, et cetera. But really, if you ask any, field medical leader, they would tell you that quality always is first and foremost over quantity. I mean, we need to have a certain level of engagements and of activity to justify teams, clearly, but quality is still critically important. And most organizations, from what I've heard and friends that I've talked to throughout the industry, metrics have been largely suspended. In this environment, is that really appropriate? Are there other alternative methods to really assess the value of the MSL organization? And in my opinion, the answer to that question is yes. But let me take it back to a broader perspective. Data generation. The pace of new data has not changed. New data is getting presented at virtual meetings, getting published on a daily basis. And in the area of oncology, which is my therapeutic area, it's coming fast and furious, right? So tons of data generation. And then look at these HCPs in terms of their ability to engage with pharmaceutical companies. And largely, there's one of two options: sales representatives or field medical. And there are those international thought leaders that get engagement from home office staff, whether it be medical or marketing, right? But if you think about the impact to the commercial organization, and you think about the impact to field medical, it's different. And this is an opportunity for field medical to shine, because these thought leaders are not engaging with the sales rep anymore. Those are few and far between, but they are engaging with MSLs. So it's an ability for field medical to demonstrate their value to their company like never before. And I'll think about medical insights in particular, which in my opinion is the #1 currency of MSLs. Taking those voice of customer and insight that you hear from your day-to-day interactions and funneling those into the company so that they could evaluate trends and themes. That's even more important now than ever, because there's no one else out there that's getting those medical insights. So it's an amazing opportunity for field medical, and I know many organizations have seized that opportunity. And I do think, although it took us a while to get used to the engagement, the differences in the engagements being virtual and the impact in terms of the numbers, but it's just an amazing time for field medical.
Yeah, I think this is great from both of you. What we heard is quality matters more than anything. Certainly meeting the objective, moving the relationship forward, especially as you're talking about engaging with KOLs. Bruno, from your perspective, and you're working, you guys, LARVOL works with a lot of companies, obviously. What are you seeing as it relates to, what has changed over the last 9 months, and how has that impacted the MSL function? And mostly, I think what everybody is curious about is, are there any successes, anything that companies doing well that I can apply out in the field next week as I'm sitting and listening to this?
Yeah, thank you, Samuel. I want to repeat the point that Alison made, which is so important, which is that a time of change and a time of, I guess, crisis at some level is an opportunity. An opportunity for field medical to evolve, to shine also, and an opportunity to change some of the practices. And the term "okay Zoomer" has been used sometimes, as opposed to "okay Boomer," to reflect on what we all becoming in some ways. As "okay Zoomer," there are new practices that are emerging. And so you're right. In our case, so we are vendor to the pharma industry. We do KOL monitoring for field medical, and one of the biggest change for us has been the implication of the fact that all the conferences, of course, are going virtual. And we don't know how long it's going to continue, but it's, of course, changed a lot the situation for our customers, who saw really conferences as a super important opportunity for engagement. And so first, they continue to ask us to monitor the activity of the conference for the medical insights that Alison was mentioning. But on top of that, our customers, they ask us to look a lot more at social media activity. So, for example, ESMO in cancer, of course, just took place, completely virtual, a great success. The amount of data, huge amount of data, notably in lung cancer, huge amount of data, and the conversation on that data, a lot of it took place on social media, on Twitter in particular. And so what our customers are doing is that they themselves, but they ask us to monitor that conversation among thought leaders. In the quality of that conversation on Twitter, the surveys that thought leaders initiate, asking each other whether or not that new data creates or not a new standard of care, to me is mind-boggling. And it wasn't the case a year ago. Even ASCO wasn't quite the level that ESMO just had a couple of weeks ago. So how an organization sort of gets a new way of listening, if not engaging, because engagement in social media obviously is problematic, but certainly listening and finding new ways later on of using these medical insights in the practice of the work of the MSLs. To me, that's the biggest learning over the last few months.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a excellent point, and I think that's where, you know, certainly where all of this is headed is one of the things that we've learned from all of this is, you know, we have to approach things a new way, and so that's certainly going to be you know, an aspect that we've all had to adjust. Um, I want to take a couple of questions from the audience. We're getting some great questions in. One question that that came up, and again, if I ever, for all of you listening, if I ever mispronounce your name, I apologize. I will only use your first name, and I'm going to read your question verbatim, so you know that your question was asked, because I think that's part of the value. I know for all of you listening is to get your questions asked, and I will ask the questions that I think are broad enough that will appeal to the broadest audience. So here's a question from Maria. Maria says, "Do you think?" And maybe we could go back and start with Allison on this. And I'd like to all of you guys to address this. But do you think data being released and available will slow down since many clinical trials globally have been put on hold? And if so, how will that affect MSLs? Allison, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it did impact a lot of clinical trials, but I think the FDA was pretty aggressive in putting out their you know, guidance for how to keep these studies going in a virtual environment. I know we've seen some conversion in studies to a telehealth option. And that's not just true for company-sponsored studies, but I think, you know, that those options need to be considered for ISTs and real-world evidence studies. I think, you know, you may actually see the opposite. And I think one thing that this has opened an opportunity for is a lot more time dedicated in the absence of you know, having that usual field engagement, but kind of a faster pace with, you know, what data can we generate? And part of it is in response to MSL insights, right? Where we're out there talking to people, we identify data gaps, and it, you know, it's almost like the company now has the space without the huge external commitment to really think about what data we can generate right now. Are there retrospective studies we can do? Are there, you know, more population-based studies? Are there EMR studies? So I think what you might see is, instead of fewer studies reading out, you might actually see more, but the nature of them might change a little bit. I think that could potentially be one impact of COVID, but it's an interesting question. I do think we've been able to maintain a lot of the kind of rigorous placebo-controlled ongoing clinical trials in this environment, but that may be therapeutic area dependent as well. There may be some therapeutic areas where that's just not an option. But I'd be curious to hear the thoughts of others on that as well.
Yeah, Vanessa, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a very insightful question, and I wish I had a firm answer, but I do think it is highly dependent on the therapeutic area and the unmet need in that area. And some areas have been impacted to a lesser extent than others. I also think it depends on the trial in terms of where it's at. You know, are they recruiting patients, or, you know, is the trial fully enrolled? And so, you know, there's a lot of different elements, but in general, I would say if there was going to be an impact, a negative impact, I should say, with regards to data generation, I think it's going to take some time for that to be felt. And I think, you know, depending on the nature of the patient population and the duration of the trial, if it's an event-driven trial versus, you know, is it a 6-month primary endpoint or a 12-week primary endpoint, will impact it. And so, you know, hopefully at the end of the day, there are many different types of studies ongoing with different designs that it won't negatively impact it. I mean, I think the answer is, you know, it hasn't impacted it yet from data availability, presentation, publication.
Yeah, I think these are excellent points. Bruno, from LARVOL's perspective, anything you guys are seeing to add to that?
We heard the same thing in cancer in particular, but I'm sure in other areas as well. And as what you said, the impact did not show at ESMO. ESMO has an amazing amount of data, but we should expect it later. Maybe even in 1 year, there might be a big drop in data release when all the data that should have been at the point of delivering data would have been delayed. So it's going to be a delayed impact probably.
Yep, absolutely. I think excellent points. I want to take one more here from a question, and I'm curious if you guys can address this. And Allison, maybe I'll just jump back over to you first, just to get us started. Carlo has asked. He says, definitely agree that it's best to measure quality over quantity to measure MSL impact. So kind of going back to this thought. What are some concrete best practice examples of metrics on this, or maybe some things that you guys have seen that have worked, or other companies that you're aware of? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, so, you know, I think I mentioned it before, but it really is the end game, right? The insights that we collect that drive company strategy, medical strategy, clinical strategy. I think that, you know, if those discussions that you're having are informing the company in the right way, then that's a great outcome to measure. It might be something like actionable insights. You know, did you bring something in from a KOL that, you know, really gave us an idea of something to pursue? And I think we do have that ability to flex a little bit more now in this environment. There's a lot more focus on what more can we do. And one of those things, if we're doing it right, should be driven by the insights that the MSLs collect. I think the value you bring to your KOLs, I think as we look at, I mentioned it before, but podium advocacy, you know, when you hear your KOLs speaking at a virtual congress, or, you know, there are lots of seminars now occurring over social media platforms where people are trying to maintain their education and trying to keep up with new data. And that's true externally in delivering value to KOLs who probably are as swamped as almost anybody, and maybe can't find the time to dedicate to a conference in the same way that they did in the past. I know I'm missing arriving at a medical conference and going through the program and thinking of all the sessions I'm going to go to. And in the virtual environment, it's much harder to do because your day job is still kind of front and center. So, you know, I think delivering that scientific value is incredibly important, and then seeing, you know, KOLs incorporating some of those discussions, whether you alerted them to a new article, a disease state, topic of interest, anything like that, where they start leveraging that information with others is a great outcome to really show impact. It's not related to the number of meetings you had with them, but it was the quality of the meeting that you did have. That's tremendously important. And then even just the internal activities, the training support you provide. I mentioned the medical conferences. A lot of people are in, you know, teleconferences and Zoom calls all day and maybe miss things. And I know we've approached conference coverage much the way we always would, and that is, you know, making sure that we're communicating into the company the key data presentations that could impact how we make decisions. But then also think about opportunities of, you know, we're missing those live poster sessions. It stinks not to be able to walk through there and talk to the author. And, you know, are there ways that we, you know, if we see something really impactful, that we could bring that KOL to speak to a broader team internally. So I think there are some opportunities there, but I really think it gets back to values, scientific credibility, educational support, supporting the company internally from a training marketing and data awareness perspective. But really, it gets back to value every time, which is what we should have always been focused on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an example of nothing has changed, right?
Yep.
There. Vanessa, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Alice and I agree with everything that you mentioned. I couldn't agree more. And just to add to that, I think really in terms of quality, there's really two ways to assess quality in terms of my perspective. So the first is through direct observation. So being in the field with the MSL, or in today's case, being on a Zoom with the MSL. And there's really three things that I think most field leadership folks are looking for or evaluating. The first is scientific acumen. The second is communication skills. And the third is kind of a caveat around communication, but the ability, the art, if you will, of asking questions. And that kind of ties into the medical insight piece. And so you can observe an MSL through their engagement, and you could really assess whether the quality and the is there and the MSL is meeting the expectations set forth by the company for that engagement. The other piece of it that I think is important, and this is something that you don't need to be in the field, whether it's in person or virtually with an MSL to assess, but it's the extent of the relationship. So in general, I would say where there is deep relationships with the MSL and the HCP or the thought leader, that is an indicator to me of high quality exchange. Because if the HCP didn't find the MSL to be a scientific resource and of value, they would not take the time to engage with that MSL. And in fact, they may not even know who that MSL is. So no observation is needed for that. It's pretty clear cut. Either the relationship is there and it's a deep relationship, or it's more of a superficial relationship, and in some unfortunate instances, there is no relationship. So that's kind of the lens in which I view quality.
Yeah, and I think also, would you both agree that a very simple way to measure this is that oftentimes what we're seeing is neglected is simply ask the KOLs, right? Doing KOL surveys and constant engagement with them in terms of inquiring, is this valuable? Is that something that you guys have seen is an effective way to measure outcomes as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done surveys before for HCPs. We've done them in different ways over the years. I'm a big believer in one simple question, and that is, would you recommend this MSL to a colleague? Yes
Beautiful.
or no? I mean, that you
Yep.
could ask a lot of questions, but that's where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion. And there's, third-party vendors that do these surveys too. So people are somewhat divided whether they're for or against that approach. But I've seen it used quite successfully in the past. And it's also good for benchmarking against competitor companies and their field medical organization as well.
I would agree
Excellent.
with that. We just, ironically, we had just initiated a KOL survey just right before the start of COVID, and the results came out kind of well into it. We revised some of the questions to get a sense of what people are looking for in a post-COVID world and what our KOL preferences are. The interesting thing that came out of it, and I think we fail to appreciate this sometimes, is it's good for getting the KOL insights, but sometimes it's even better for internal education. So I fully agree with what Vanessa said about one of the key questions you can ask is would they recommend the MSL to a colleague? And I think a second one is also, did you ever use the information you heard from the MSL in a conversation with another physician, in a group presentation, those kinds of things, which kind of get at that broader impact. And it's such a critical part of the job. As we surveyed our KOLs, I try to use it a little bit also to inform what those expectations can be. A lot of them are saying that, or pre-COVID, a lot of them were saying that they had very little interest in engaging virtually, and that's fundamentally changed to the point where about 70% reliably say they're willing to engage virtually. So that can give you a nice benchmark of what can I really expect.
Yeah.
And that varies by therapeutic area for sure, but it can also inform how we make decisions about head count, what our expectations should be, how we tailor our work to suit our KOLs in this kind of brave new world. So it can inform a lot of things, but I think, my goodness, the results of those surveys are so helpful just to educate internal colleagues on what do MSLs do and what is the real value they bring.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, and for everybody listening, of course, the MSL Society has conducted several surveys now from the MSL's perspective on what they're doing during the COVID and number of engagements and how long those engagements last. And then now we've, of course, conducted 2 surveys with KOLs. And so I think along with what both Vanessa and Allison have said, doing your own internal, but also using some of the stuff from the MSL Society, again, I think just helps to manage realistic expectations. Bruno, any thoughts on this?
Not much to add, except for maybe a question back, either from the survey or from the experience of Alison and Vanessa. How much of these virtual engagement involve webcam as opposed to just phone or just sound, audio? And what is sort of the etiquette around webcam or no webcam? Webcam, it's inviting someone in your home in some ways. Have you found any best practice or etiquette sort of guidelines with regard to webcam in these virtual engagements?
My goodness, that's a tough one. I would say, we've done a lot of the webcam ones, but it's less for that face-to-face piece than being able to show data. So that's, if your agenda for a meeting with a KOL is around, showing them some specific data, it kind of necessitates that piece. The harder thing is, a lot of us have kids at home who are trying to do virtual school and the unpredictability associated with when they'll show up. I've seen situations where the KOLs are having the same challenges, which also, humanizes you a little bit. I think, it allows us to be understanding of each other. But I think we've seen a lot of phone engagements go up as well. So if it's not a data-driven discussion, I think it's really driven by the KOL's preference. Some will ask for a phone call, some will ask for a Zoom meeting. But I think it's very KOL dependent, honestly. But I think we also have to respect our MSLs and say, you have to do what you're comfortable with and make that decision for yourself.
Understand.
Absolutely agree. And I think, Bruno, I'd love to have a number to give you, but I don't think it's possible because that level of segmentation, whether somebody has their camera turned on, we don't necessarily capture that. We capture, virtual, phone, in person, but for that virtual engagement, is the webcam on? It's hard to say, but I think it's so important to respect the preference of the KOL or the HCP and follow their lead. If they have their camera on and the MSL is comfortable turning theirs on, I recommend it. Or the MSL, if they're comfortable, they could have their camera on regardless of whether the HCP has it on. So you kind of have to be flexible because not everyone likes to have their camera on. So I think that's an important kind of thing to take into consideration.
Yep, understand. Yep.
And I think more than anything else, what we've seen from the 2 surveys from KOLs, we asked that specifically about engaging virtual with a virtual platform like Zoom, GoToWebinar, whatever it is, and they are willing and are engaging with KOLs. And so I think that's an important part of this expectation. We got a great question that is impacting a lot of people that I'd love all of you to address. Rachel has asked an important question that certainly a lot of MSLs are going through, whether you are a brand new hire, you know, if you've just started your MSL career during the COVID, or you've made a transition to another company, or maybe even a different therapeutic area. And Rachel has asked, and maybe you guys could, you both could, or all three of you rather, could address this and give any thoughts or advice on this. Is what about those that, 1 second here. What about looking at, sorry, I lost my place there for a second. What about looking at the quality? So going back to this idea of really how this has impacted us. What about the looking at the quality for new MSLs who do not have existing relationships? So what's changed there? What advice? What's working? Vanessa, any thoughts on that?
In terms of quality, assessing it, I think it still goes down to the same three fundamentals. Is the scientific acumen strong? Is the MSL an effective communicator? And do they know how to extract information in a manner such that the HCP doesn't feel like they're being interrogated? And I think that applies to whether you've been an MSL for, 5 months or 5 years. So I don't think that's changed. I think the piece that is really changed is the ability to create and establish a relationship in a virtual environment. And that's a lot harder to do virtually. And so one of the best practices that I'd like to highlight is around the ability to leverage either a colleague at your current organization. So is there someone else within your company that has a relationship with this HCP that's willing to make an introduction? Or is there another HCP that you have a relationship with that's willing to make an introduction? So it's not about how you assess the quality. It's more about, the difference, in my opinion, is more about the difficulty in establishing new relationships virtually. Allison, what do you think?
Boy, I agree with everything you said, and I think it is a realistic concern. It's much harder to get started in this kind of environment than when you already know your KOLs and could text one and say, hey, do you have a few minutes free? I'd like your thoughts on X, Y, or Z. I mean, those are two fundamentally different situations. And I think, similar to what Vanessa said, I would say it's leveraging those relationships. If there are warm handoffs that can be done, introductions that can be made, that can be of tremendous value. The second piece, I think, really is, I mentioned it before, but really purposeful agenda and value-driven reasons to meet without asking too much time. And I think you have to have that initial conversation to understand the KOL's background and understand their practice or their research interests, and kind of walk into it with that knowledge and a questioning approach to establish that I'm interested in understanding what you're interested in baseline. But also, to shorten those up, tighten them up a little bit, have maybe, one key value driver that you're bringing in. And all of us who work on the management side or the internal side need to be really, really thoughtful about, giving people the right tools to engage people. And also being understanding that there's going to be a little bit of a slow uptick, right? It just is going to be a slower process to get those relationships established, but I absolutely think they can be. I think there's a lot to be done, and I think as KOLs get more used to it, it's going to get easier to do. But I think it's a realistic challenge, and I think it's something we all need to be sensitive to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. Bruno, any thoughts on this from companies you're working with?
Well, as I was listening, I was reflecting on how I met Alison at a conference 2 years ago, and although we have not talked, now the relationship, Alison, is different, because we met one time at a conference in person, and And how powerful is that? One meeting in person, and after that, even if you talk with someone on an occasional basis, not in person, the relationship accrue in a sort of way. And of course, as per the question, which is an excellent question, if you don't have that starting point, how do you do it? And I think that for me, social media, which is of course an interesting but a tricky topic, is always super interesting. For example, is your organization allowing you to connect with your KOL on LinkedIn and on Twitter? Is your organization allowing you to like their comment, or actually no liking? We can connect but not liking. And the third level is your organization, the compliance, allow you to make comments? And usually I think that third one, the answer is no. But the answer to the first two questions, I guess I'll be curious about what Vanessa and Alison might have to say. But that's a valuable, I think that could be moving forward an important aspect of connecting with someone through, it's in particular, of course, Twitter and LinkedIn.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, but,
there are a lot of different regulations around. Every company, I think, has a different approach, but at its most basic, monitoring those for insights about your KOLs can really help. And it might be as simple as reaching out to somebody if you're trying to establish that relationship and say, I saw your presentation over, the Neurology Now on Twitter, or I saw your comment on X, Y, or Z, and I'd love to learn more about that. And I think it's no different than when you are starting out in a live environment and saying, I read this article, it was really interesting, I have some questions for you, to start that conversation. So I think you're right, it's one more tool. I think it's tough when it's connecting and commenting and those kinds of things, but it's absolutely one more tool we can use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is great, and certainly it's about finding those tools and what works and what's right for your situation. We're running out of time, but I did want to just address two more primary topics, and we're getting a lot of questions in from the audience, which is great. Keep them coming. We're going to try to get to a couple more here. But I'd like for Vanessa and Allison and Bruno, if you could, at this point in the program, get out your crystal balls. Let's talk a little bit about some predictions. Where is this all going? I'm being a bit facetious about the crystal ball. I realize nobody really knows, but just based on your years of experience and where the role is today and what's happened since the COVID, especially focused around the idea of offering solutions. Vanessa, I'm going to let you go first on this. Any comments, thoughts on this?
Well, I'm gonna take an easy element of this kind of prediction, and that is around physical access. Yeah. I can tell you with a high degree of certainty that physical access into an institution is forever changed. Credentialing in those facilities that don't currently use a credentialing system will likely implement one. The requirements as part of the credentialing process, whether it's proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test within a certain time frame, those will also become much more stringent. So I feel fairly confident about that. And so that will kind of influence when and where people could meet, because depending on how difficult the requirements are, it may be easier to meet outside of the hospital or outside of the clinic. And again, that's going to be much harder for a commercial entity, less so than field medical. But that's kind of my perspective, and I'll let Bruno and Allison take the more difficult elements of that prediction.
Fair enough. Allison?
Yeah, boy, the crystal ball one is hard. I think the amount of lasting effect this is going to have is going to be directly proportional to the duration of this. And I think that's still a big question mark. But, a lot of this is habits. And, we're trying new things, but making those things a standard practice is going to depend on the amount of time you have to make it part of your way of doing things. I do think it's forever changed. I think some of the things that will change is, we're finding that for some KOLs, Zoom meetings are incredibly effective. It's almost their preference now, and we may have a population that prefer to meet that way. I think, historically, because that relationship building piece has been, seen as such an important part of the MSL role, it's been very focused on face-to-face meetings as being king, and that may not be the case in the future. I think it'll be more tailored to the KOL. I think that might impact the MSLs in terms of quality of life, right? That for those with larger territories or, significant driving within their territories and trying to coordinate schedules, I could see a future where maybe you do need to travel less. Maybe you incorporate the two, where you have a face-to-face meeting with somebody and bring somebody else in via Zoom and maintain that kind of cross KOL discussion. So I think there's a ton of opportunity, but I think the impact is really going to be dependent on how long we're in this situation, which right now looks like it'll be a while, but I'm excited to see what happens. But I still think no matter what, once we get back and find that right balance, I think it's still, my hope is that it'll still be the most fun job in the industry.
Yep. Bruno, any thoughts?
I think I want to become an MSL based on all of that. This is exciting, and I agree that certainly. Well, first, this is incredible. I mean, 2020, we'll always remember 2020 as an incredible year, and at some point, the crisis will be done, but there are going to be changes, as Alice had mentioned, and Vanessa, that are not going to come back. Field medical, I think at the end is going to come stronger, more validated compared with commercial, and having learned new tricks to adapt to KOL's new preferences. And at the end of the day, the key word mentioned earlier is value. This is a relationship, not a transactional industry. And relationship is based on two things. It's based on creating value, and it's based on the human component. And the human component now is going to use new tools to be conveyed, to be reinforced, to accrue over time. But ultimately, the value needs to be there, and the genuine interest and motivation of the MSL to create value for their KOL and their HCP is going to be the key. So I agree with what was said. It's a super exciting time. I might join the MSL industry and quit my job as CEO of a vendor company.
That's great, Bruno. Look, I just consulted my crystal ball, and this is what I came up with. I have a guarantee. I'll put myself out there and I'll offer a guarantee. There's very few guarantees in life, but here's one of them. This is what I guarantee is going to happen in the future, and that is what will never change is the core of what MSLs do is add value, both internally and externally. But if we focus on adding value to KOLs, and even if that means uncovering new ways and discovering those ways, but most importantly, executing on that, that will remain core to the value of the MSL to their company. Vanessa, Allison, would you agree with those statements?
For sure.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So now we have 3 guarantees. So anybody who has any objection to that, please reach out to Allison and Vanessa, not me. I'm just kidding. So we're wrapping up our time here. And again, I apologize to everybody out there if I'm not pronouncing names right, but I just wanted to plug in one. Sheena said, would you recommend networking with other MSLs right now to gain more insight and quality initiatives that other companies are doing? Absolutely. And there's actually a great organization that you can do this with, Sheena. It's called the Medical Science Liaison Society. Absolutely, it's why we have a community. It's why we're doing this conference. I would highly recommend that you reach out to other MSLs from other companies. You're not looking for proprietary information, but best practices. Vanessa, Allison, would you agree with that?
Completely. Bring on the ideas.
Yes. Share. Here's my last. We're wrapping up time. I want all of this to be very practical, very pragmatic. So I'm going to end with this. And Vanessa, I'm going to let you go first. Is there one piece of advice or tip or best practice that you've seen either with your own organizations or with others that, as it relates to, again, thinking about this challenge and solutions that MSLs are facing right now, anything immediately come to mind? And thinking about MSL sitting in 63 countries, what would you say?
I think more so now than ever before, you need to prepare for having your time dramatically shortened during that virtual engagement. So even though you're planning on 30 minutes, if you only have 5, what are you going to communicate? And I think that's what separates a good MSL from a great MSL. So anytime you go into an engagement, make sure you have that 5 or 10-minute version of what you want to share ready to go, because there are no guarantees. There's a lot of disruptions and a lot of things that are impacting schedules. So that would be my practical tip.
Excellent. Ooh, might I just plug in something extra there? I know some people don't like this, but I'm going to plug it because I think it's important. Are you referring to having a plan when you actually go in and engage with every KOL? Can I take that a little further?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Beautiful. That was impromptu, but I love it because that's my big soapbox, if you will. Allison?
Yeah, I would say, definitely have a plan. That is the gold standard of being an effective MSL. But I'd say in this day and age, be creative. Try new things. Nobody has all the answers right now. And the more that you can flex and try new things and see what works and communicate that out, I think we'll all be better off for it. And this profession will continue to grow in an amazing way.
Excellent. Great. Bruno, want to close us out? Companies you're working with, things you've observed, best practices?
The point I was about to make is actually a little bit different, but I'm going to make it anyway. I think that if I were an MSL or if I were managing MSL, the most important thing for me will be, as an MSL, at the end of my call, did I enjoy the call? Because if I enjoy the call with the KOL, the chances are the KOL also enjoyed the call. So making sure that that moment spent with the KOL is ultimately a moment that is enjoyed by the MSL, maybe is a great proxy for success as well. So that's a point I wanted to make.
Excellent. With that, I know we're out of time, but Allison, Vanessa, thank you very much for sharing your observations and experience to this important topic. Bruno, thank you very much for being here, and especially for LARVOL stepping up and being a sponsor this year. We really appreciate it. For all of you listening, Vanessa and Allison and Bruno are all on the app. Reach out to them, engage. If you guys have follow-up questions, hopefully you found this valuable. But we're going to close here. Just a reminder, the next section is going to kick off in about 30 minutes. In the interim, get on the app, get involved, engage, participate in the app, reach out to the sponsors, make sure you're engaging with them. And with that, I want to say thank everyone and really appreciate the active participation. So Bruno, Vanessa, Allison, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.